Cath Anne, and welcome to the Homework Help Global's The Learning Studio. This week, we actually recorded, this is our second recording of this session, because we had a couple of technical difficulties and we wanted to make sure that we were providing you with the best content possible. So I am recording this session again so that you can access it on YouTube and all of the other platforms that we upload this information to. So hopefully this is of value to you. And if you have been a regular viewer for the past 3 or 4 episodes, you will notice that I am not in my office space right at the moment. It was a little bit too sunny over there by the window, so I have moved and I am on my couch today, so I hope that you are able to see me pretty clearly. It was just a little sunny and we wanted to get the best video possible, so hopefully that's helpful. So I wanted to jump into the academic content this week because I know that you are probably getting busy with writing papers and starting to study for midterms. So we thought it would be great to provide you with some information about how to write an effective thesis statement. And in the session on Tuesday, there was a lot of really good dialogue and conversation around how to write an effective thesis statement. We had some good questions. So I am going to cover that all in this session as well. So let's jump into the content. So first I wanted to go over, I guess I'll give you an overview of what I would like to cover in this session. So I want to go over what specifically is a thesis statement, how a thesis statement differs from a topic sentence, when you would use a thesis statement, how to write a thesis statement, and then I'll give you some examples of different kinds of thesis statements and ideas for writing thesis statements, as well as contrast a good statement with a not so great statement. So let's get into the good stuff. A thesis statement is the main point of your paper. So you want to bear in mind when you're writing a paper, what is the point of writing a paper? You want to put forth the idea that you're either arguing something or you're giving an opinion. So you're looking at a body of research and hopefully you're relatively knowledgeable about it because you've given yourself some time to prepare to write the paper and you're not writing it last minute. But you want to form an argument or an opinion based on personal experience or based on your academic background and understanding of the content. You want to develop some kind of an opinion that you're going to put forth in your paper. And essentially that is what a thesis statement is. It captures your argument or your opinion. Your thesis statement can also act as a guide for your paper. So for example, sometimes in my experience when I've been writing papers, I'll get to the 3rd or 4th paragraph and I'll kind of lose my way a little bit because I'll get kind of entrenched in the research and really absorbed, and I'll think to myself, okay, why am I writing this paper? So that's why it's a good idea to have a really strong thesis statement. So when you do come to that point in writing your essay, if you do, you can look back to your thesis statement and say, okay, now I remember why I'm writing and what the point of my essay is. So you really want to have a strong thesis statement. Now, that's not to say that when you start writing and you start learning more about your topic, that your thesis statement won't change, because it can change and grow, and you can modify it as time goes on. But like I said, it does have it acts as an anchor for your paper. So you'll want to make sure that you do write one at the beginning of your paper and make sure that it's kind of framing what you'll be talking about. So I wanted to differentiate between the topic and the thesis statement. So the thesis statement is kind of that, like I said, overall argument or opinion, whereas the topic is more specific to the actual information and evidence that you'll be providing. Your thesis statement is not just a fact. Like I said, it kind of incites a debate, and you're taking a position or a stance on a topic. So the topic would be that information and evidence that you provide to back up your thesis statement. So whereas the thesis statement is kind of the overall kind of overarching theme of your paper, the topic are the specific information that you're providing. So like, as I mentioned, a strong thesis statement gives your paper some dimension, it gives your paper some direction, and people know where you're going with the paper. At the beginning of your thesis statement, you can either formulate it into one sentence, or you can use a couple of sentences that provide the evidence that you'll be discussing within the rest of your paper. So important to note is that when you're writing a thesis statement, you want to consider whether you can prove it. So hopefully you've done a good overview of your research, and you'll know kind of what next steps you'll want to be providing in your paper that prove your thesis statement. So you're not just going to pull something out of thin air. It's going to be a well-researched, formulated argument. So you want to be asking questions like, can I prove this? So hopefully you've done a bit of an outline, and you understand what your content of your paper is going to be, and that's going to provide the basis for your thesis statement. So I'm going to give you a bit of an example just so we can get started off, because I think examples are helpful rather than just kind of talking about the theoretical concept of what a thesis statement is. And I was hoping to be able to show you my screen, but I tried that before and I haven't quite figured that out. So I'm actually just going to read these to you. So hopefully that's okay and that's somewhat helpful. So for example, consider that your thesis statement is this: there are several ways for college students to improve their study habits. That's a very, very simple and basic thesis statement. But then when you're considering the topic, maybe some of the evidence that you're providing is the following. Students can improve their study by studying in a quiet environment, pay attention in class, and manage your time. So as you can see, all of these topics could be discussed further, and they all contribute to explaining the thesis statement. So these pieces of information would be considered the topic or the topics, whereas the thesis statement is there are several ways for college students to improve their study habits. So as you can see, the thesis statement is kind of that overarching argument, whereas the topic are the evidence and the information that you're providing. So you would want to also flush out some of this evidence. So a way to do this might be saying studying in a quiet environment helps students improve their study habits. So that's a piece of evidence that can be used to prove your thesis statement. Okay? And then in the initial session, we discussed, where does your thesis statement go? A good practice is to put your thesis statement in the opening paragraph, and you always want to make sure that your thesis statement isn't getting bogged down within a large paragraph. So you always want to kind of put it towards the end of your introductory paragraph. You might preface it with some information and some background, maybe some history, and then put your thesis statement either in the second to last or last sentence so that it kind of frames your paper and your reader knows what to expect next. And then another point that was brought up during the first session is that you could also use your thesis statement to introduce 3 points of evidence or 3 topics, as I already mentioned before. So you can use that, you can have kind of 2 sentences which introduce your thesis and then provide evidence. And so this is a really clear and direct way to provide information to the reader and let them know what to expect in the rest of your paper. And then hopefully that will trigger them to keep reading your paper. Another thing I wanted to go over is this idea about how to write properly and academically. So as a beginning student, I know it was tempting for me sometimes when I first began my degree to start out a paper and say things like, this paper will discuss blah, blah, blah. Or the topic of this paper will be such and such. This is not an appropriate way to write an academic paper, although it might seem a little bit more clear. Professors don't like this, and it just does not show a strong level of writing skill. So you're really going to want to do your research and develop a strong thesis statement that provides information while not being too obvious, like those types of statements. So when you're writing your thesis statement, you're going to want to ask yourself, is this statement specific? You don't want it to be too general because you want your reader to get a sense of what you're going to be talking about in particular. So as such, you're going to want to avoid words such as interesting, exciting, unusual, difficult, negative. All of those words are vague. They're vague words. They don't really tell you much about what the topic is going to be. They don't really give much emphasis to what you'll be discussing. So for example, you would want to avoid a statement like, the book by Brené Brown is interesting. That doesn't tell me anything about the book, doesn't tell me anything about Brené Brown. It doesn't tell me anything about why I think the book is interesting or why the reader should think it's interesting. So it's a very vague statement. Although that's a really simple example, you can see how that kind of a statement isn't really helpful to the reader. You'll also want to avoid words like society, values, culture, because although you're, as an undergraduate student or even a graduate student, you know that it's probably going to be your professor that reads your paper. You don't know how your professor is going to interpret that word or your reader is going to interpret that word. So words like society and culture, unless you're in a sociology program, they're kind of vague and they're not, everyone has a different understanding of what those kinds of words mean. So unless you really truly define those concepts or unless you're discussing those concepts, you'll want to avoid them because they're kind of just very general and you want to make sure that you're being a bit more specific in your writing. And so yes, as I mentioned, you're going to want to avoid making generalizations about a topic. So for example, this is kind of a vague and not very specific example of a thesis statement. Today's horror movies present serious challenges to society. Similar to the other statement, doesn't really tell me much about horror movies. It doesn't tell me anything about what society I'm talking about and what the challenges are that these movies present. So more specifically, you might want to write something like, modern cinematic techniques have provided filmmakers with the opportunity to create more graphic films. Therefore, horror movies have desensitized Canadian youth. So I can read that again. Modern cinematic techniques have provided filmmakers with the opportunity to create more graphic films. Therefore, horror movies have desensitized Canadian youth. So that is a very specific thesis statement. It tells me that there are different techniques that are used now to create more graphic films. Horror movies are clearly more graphic as well. And then it makes an argument that because of this, Canadian youth have become desensitized to violence. So that makes me want to keep reading because I want to hear what this person has to say about Canadian youth being desensitized by horror movies. So there's a lot more detail, a lot more specificity in this statement as compared to the one that I read before. Today's horror movies present serious challenges to society. So you also want to make sure that your thesis statement is clear. One example of a not so great thesis statement is, eating fast food is bad for human health. It's a very general statement. It's more of a statement and it doesn't really give us any proof about anything. Maybe there's a little bit of an argument, but not really. So an alternative to that would be, regular consumption of fast foods can lead to preventable and chronic health conditions such as diabetes, obesity, and heart disease. Therefore, Canadians should limit their intake. And I'll read that one again. Regular consumption of fast foods can lead to preventable and chronic health conditions such as diabetes, obesity, and heart disease. Therefore, Canadians should limit their intake. So as you can see, it gives you some evidence of chronic health conditions. You are aware that the writer is probably going to discuss some of these health conditions a little bit more in depth. Then it makes an argument that Canadians should limit their intake of these items because of the alleged health conditions. So that is a very specific and thorough thesis statement. So one of the topics that came up during our first live stream session was someone brought up the idea that their high school professor always was asking them when they were writing essays, you want to make sure that when someone is reading your essay and they ask, so what? That you have an answer for that question. So when you're writing a thesis statement, when you're writing an essay, ask yourself, so what? Why should the reader care about what you're writing? And I think that's a really, really strong way of being able to understand why you're writing an essay and what the point of your essay is. And that will really strengthen your essay. So I think, if you take anything away from this, remember the words, so what? Because it's such a simple thing to recall, but I think it offers such a strength to your ability to write an essay. If it's too vague, too general, if it's just a statement, your reader isn't going to care about what you're writing. But if you're being more specific, if you're triggering some interest, then maybe the reader will say, oh, okay, this person has something to say, and continue reading. So I'll give you another example of a thesis statement. Canada has a high homeless population. That is not a very good thesis statement. It's vague, it can't be argued, it doesn't give you any evidence, no proof. So an alternative to that is, oh, where did my example go? Goodness, I lost my example. Well, let's move on to another one. So another thing that you want to make sure is that you are not being wishy-washy. So you want to take, what I mean by that is you want to take a stance when you're writing an essay. So instead of saying something like, secondhand smoking is bad and can cause heart disease and cancer. Therefore, smoking should be outlawed in public places. But outlawing smoking is unfair to smokers, so maybe non-smokers can just hold their breath or wear masks around smokers instead. Okay, I know that is a funny statement, but I think it gets across the point that the person who's writing this doesn't really have an opinion on the matter. They're kind of going back and forth. When you're writing an essay, you want to take a stand on something and you want to make an argument. So as an alternative, this could be a very strong thesis statement. Secondhand smoke is just as harmful as smoking and leads to higher prevalence of heart disease and cancer. What's worse, people who inhale secondhand smoke are doing so without consent. Therefore, smoking in public places should be banned. So you can see how that is much stronger thesis statement. It alludes to potential health concerns that are caused by cancer or caused by smoking. It suggests that people who inhale smoke are doing so without consent, and therefore it argues that smoking in public places should be banned. So that is a stronger thesis statement than the first one because it takes a stance on the issue and it makes an argument. I'm sorry that I misplaced my other statement. Oh well, that's okay. We'll just move on. So, so I wanted to go over some kind of tips to writing thesis statements. So, 1, make sure you know your topic. Like I mentioned, you're going to want to make sure that you do a thorough job of research. You want to know your topic inside and out before you kind of start writing. So write down notes, make an outline, gather your information, and as such, give yourself lots of time to work on the essay. Because if you're doing it last minute, then you're not going to have the time that it takes to kind of do a full overview and a full literature review into the topic. So you want to give yourself time to process and to form an opinion about what you're going to be writing about. And that's going to get you the best grade and help you to do the best work you can do. You'll also want to consider your personal experience or any other research that you've done that kind of informs your opinion. Because as you continue to learn and explore as a student, you will develop a stronger opinion about different things, especially if you're focused in a certain discipline. So you're going to eventually develop an opinion the more that you gather information. So give yourself the time to explore that. You're also going to want to consider limiting your topic. So you're probably, if you're in an undergraduate degree or even in a graduate degree, you're going to mostly be limited to 5 to 10 page papers. So you don't want to take on a huge, broad topic and not be able to do it justice. So you're going to want to narrow it down very specifically, and in turn, then your thesis statement will be specific as well. And you want to make sure that you're giving yourself enough content to work with, but also not going so broad that you can't be very specific. Another kind of tip is that goes along with the first thing I mentioned is do some brainstorming. So while you're doing your research, write down some ideas, keep some notes, and then go back to them and see if you start to see any patterns emerge. And as you do that, you will evidently develop an opinion about the topic that you're thinking of covering. So essentially, if there is anything I want to put forth in this session, it is that question of so what? Why is the person reading this, and why should they care about what they're reading? When you're writing your statement, what is the reader gaining from this? So you're wanting to provide the reader some value and some information. And why do you care about writing about this? And that should help you to frame your thesis statement. What do you want your audience to walk away with? What kind of information do you want to provide to your audience that they will come away and say, I'm glad I read that paper? And that should help you to formulate your thesis statement. So, in sum, a thesis statement should have 3 main components. You must introduce your argument. You want to take a stand. Don't let your argument be wishy-washy. And you don't want to just regurgitate information. You want to make sure that you're taking a stance and forming an opinion. it should provide evidence, and it should show that you have some kind of interest in the topic at hand so that the reader wants to keep reading. So, I hope that was helpful. I'm glad that I was able to tape this again because unfortunately we did have some technical difficulties the first time around, but I'm hoping this was helpful. And please, next week, join us on Tuesday. I'm not sure if it's going to be during the day or in the evening, but keep tuned into Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and we will keep you posted for the next live stream with the Homework Help Global's Learning Studio. And next week, we will be covering the topic of effective research methods. So we'll be going over some things like Boolean searches, how to do research on Google Scholar and different databases, and how to maximize kind of your return on the research that you're doing. So good luck out there on all your papers and all your midterms. I know it's probably starting to get busy. So all the best, and I can't wait to see you next week. Thanks for joining me, and take care.